Let me ask Dr. Kabir to also weigh in on this matter. A number of points have been brought up by Tony there. Indeed, a lot of people, first of all, look towards the Air Force. Say, Air Force, what have you done? And the initial reports that came out was the Air Force said that we were not conducting any operations. And then it was later to come out when the Army owned up and said that actually it was one of its pilots. And so the question of specialization comes through. Look, the ground forces were said to have been sending up information, but we hear that the coordinates were mistaken, and this is what led to where we have. So I would have thought that the whole purpose of having ground forces that can send up coordinates to, the Air Forces up there, not the Air Force, but its own Army air, support up there. How can you make it make sense that coordinates were wrong, mistakes were made, upwards of 80 civilians, innocent civilians, were bombed? How can you make it make sense for us to sort of understand the dynamics of what could have gone on?
Thank you, Uncle Yori. And just to align with your and that of Tony, you can't make sense of this senseless killing. We're not talking of one collateral damage. We're talking of, at the last count, depending on which figure you want to go with, the State Emergency Management Agency mentioned 85 persons. My own sources on ground mentioned about 126. So we're looking at between that 85 and 100 plus persons that have died. So you really can't make sense of that. However, there are facts that have emerged. And in this instance, at the center of all of this is intelligence. Most times, the capability of a military force in the airspace is determined by capabilities that are also on ground, especially, and I want to emphasize this point, we're talking of an asymmetric warfare where the bad elements mingle together with the good elements. In most instances, actually use the good people, the good elements as cover, specifically for the purpose of reducing this type of air attacks against them. And so the need for prudence, the need for being circumspect in taking actions and measures that would result in mass casualties should be the number one guiding principle of the deployment of such assets. So when, for instance, the feedback we're getting is that there were some error in the misinterpretation of the coordinates that was sent. I don't want to think that the Army should give us that. If it was the Air Force, then perhaps one would even look at that as a possible issue. But the Army is a ground domineering force, as it were. Their 40 is actually on the ground. Now, speaking in technical terms of intelligence specifically, when you have assets on ground that can give you coordinates, it is expected that whatever they are using, and again, I use the word assets on ground, because in collecting intelligence, you would have assets on ground, you will have air assets for surveillance capabilities. Now, if the coordinates were generated by the assets that were airborne, then that type of mistakes can happen. But when you say the assets, especially for an army that is ground-based, it is ground-based asset that produce that coordinate, the chances of error are extremely slim. So I would most likely look at other possibilities and not necessarily errors in coordinates from assets on ground. But if the error was from assets that were flying, then I would say there is a failure of intelligence in the sense that we concentrated on just one component of the intelligence and not necessarily the other components. Mm-hmm. The other area that perhaps is not the remit of this conversation is open source intelligence. I'm a private player, I'm not a government player. I use open source intelligence, and I can tell you that what you can harvest from open source is enough to prevent what happened in Kaduna. In other words, we need to, in details, interrogate how we're collecting and how we're using that intelligence. I know maybe in the course of the conversation, we'll look at the inquiry that has been, promised by the president and probably by other arms of the government, so we can discuss all of this.
Indeed. Thank you initially, Dr. Adamu. First of all, it wasn't the Air Force, so we've come away from that.